Good afternoon, teachers. This is Renu here. I'm having a little trouble with my internet, so I'm going to keep my video off. But I very quickly welcome Shoma back to our screen here in Sri Lanka. And we're looking forward to this second session of ISC speaking and listening skills. So thank you to those of you who have joined us. Shoma, over to you. Thank you for being with us and for doing this detailed, in-depth explanation on speaking and listening skills.
Thank you so much, Renu. A very good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this series of mini webinars from Trinity College London. In today's webinar, I'm going to talk about two very important skills, listening and speaking, how they are tested through an exam like Trinity's ISE, or Integrated Skills in English. We're also going to look at the different sub-skills that come into play when we're doing listening and speaking. And last but not the least, I would also like to take you through a few practical classroom ideas that you can share with your students. And so we're going to focus on listening first, and then in the next segment, we're going to talk about speaking. The reason why I've shared this slide with all of you is because I really want to draw your attention to how important listening is as a skill. We listen twice as much as we speak. We listen 4 times as much as we read, and we listen 5 times more than we write. Now, unfortunately, this is one skill that tends to be given the short shrift because most people think that listening is something that can be mastered overnight by just practicing a couple of times, listening to a few recordings. Now, we have to understand that this is one skill that makes the heaviest processing demands on our cognitive memory. Now, when you're listening to something, it's not really that simple. There are a lot of processes at play. You're listening, your brain is trying to decode information phonologically. It's also trying to put information in the correct slot in your short-term memory, as well as understand that information. And the thing that makes it challenging is that all of this happens in real time, which means that the speaker or the recording is not going to stop and give you thinking time. So if you do not understand something, it can throw you off. It can cause a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, which we call affective filter. And in order to reduce this kind of anxiety in our students, we have to make sure that they understand these processes. They have enough practice. There are a lot of studies that say that listening can't be taught because it is a metacognitive skill that goes beyond language. You're dealing with the unknown, unpredictable, and that's absolutely true. We are dealing with unknown content when we're listening. But I very strongly believe that it can be taught in the sense that we can at least equip our learners with certain very essential strategies and tools so as to make this whole journey of listening a lot easier for them. Now, we're going to do that in a bit. We're going to talk about different kinds of strategies, but let's have a quick look at the kind of exam tasks you have in ISC. Now, if you remember what we did in the last session, we did reading and writing. These are integrated modules, right? So you have listening and speaking that is tested together in a few tasks. So listening is tested along with speaking in tasks like the topic, collaborative, and the conversation tasks, which don't worry, I'm going to talk about these tasks separately in the next segment on speaking. But listening is also tested independently or discretely to demonstrate the kind of listening students would encounter in any kind of academic setting through lectures and lessons, etc. So this kind, in ISE, the listening tasks are scaffolded to each level, according to each level. So at the lower levels, the questions are more, the tasks are more factual, right? You have questions that are more framed. At the higher levels, these questions become more and more abstract. So at the lower level, say in ISE Foundation or 1, the candidate may have to listen to something, a recording that will be played twice. They may or may not take down notes. They will have to respond to questions, report information, respond to further questions that the examiner asks. So as you can see, they're all framed and factual. On the other hand, as you go higher up in, say, IC2 or IC3, the listening recording, the listening tasks become more complex. You have to listen to a longer monologue, say about 5 or 6 minute long monologue. And candidates will have to listen to that, will have to understand information in context, will have to respond to questions asked by the examiner, will have to infer meaning. So a lot of the questions are inferential. So you move from the factual domain to more abstract territory. IC also happens to be the only exam where interactive listening is tested as a skill. So what is that? Interactive listening is where the listener plays a very active role in the listening process instead of just being a passive participant. So the candidate has to not just listen, will have to respond to information, will have to negotiate meaning with the examiner, will have to sometimes ask for clarifications, give clarifications if the need be, which is why IC is such a brilliant exam, because it gives your students, your learners, a chance to demonstrate authentic skills. So you're getting them ready for authentic skills. Right, so this is just an example of the kind of tasks that I have just spoken about, the tasks at IC1 and the tasks at IC2. This is at ISE, it's slightly at ISE2, this is what the kind of task that you would see where you have to do a lot of inference questions, answer inference questions. I would like to take you through the skills in listening, some very essential skills. So if I talk about, say, listening for gist, this is a very, very common kind of listening question in any kind of listening exam. This is where your students will have to listen for the main idea, listen for the gist, and not specific detail. So you're looking at the big picture and not the minor parts here. So what happens to your brain when you're doing a gist listening? When you're doing a gist listening, your brain automatically activates the schemata, or the background knowledge, background information, memories or language associated with that particular situation. So it's very, very important that the correct schemata is activated. And then once you've activated the correct schemata, you assign a gist meaning to what you've heard. Now, if I were to tell you now that you're soon going to listen to a recording, or you're going to listen to an interview with a pop star, and I play a financial news report, so that's going to throw you off balance. You'll be confused because you would have automatically activated the wrong schemata. So this kind of awareness is very important. And you can even do an activity like this to get your students to understand how important activating the correct schemata is. Now, there's another reason why just listening questions are very important, because it clears your brain space and you can focus on specific information. So you'll notice that in a lot of listening comprehension exams, the questions are repeated. The recording is played twice. So on the first time that you hear the recording, you're asked to give a gist meaning to what you've heard. And then you are allowed to take down notes, and the recording is played another time and you have to give answer specific information. So this is one of the reasons why recordings are played twice in exams. Now, let's also have a look at a few things that you need to remember when you're doing a gist listening. Just give me a second, please. Right. So the things that our learners need to understand when they're doing a gist listening is that they don't have to understand everything, right? So you move with the flow, you try and figure out things, you try and get as much information as possible that will help you to establish the correct schemata, will that activate the correct schemata, and also understand the meaning, the general meaning of what you've heard. And the second thing is they have to remember that for any kind of discourse, whatever is important will always be emphasized. So you need to train your ears to pick on these clues. And the third thing is that in any kind of language, there will be clues, and you need to be able to pick on those clues. So, what are these clues? The most important ones are your signal words. Remember, in reading and writing, we did signal words. This is equally important, if not more, in a listening comprehension exam. So, every discourse will have some signal word which will lead you. They're like roadmaps and they lead you to your main idea. So, you need to be able to identify those signal words. So, for example, on one hand, or say, firstly, secondly, the next. So these are your connectors. So these are some of the things that our students need to remember when they are doing a gist listening. But it's all absolutely fine. You know how to do it, but you also need to practice with your learners what gist listening actually would entail. So one activity that you could do as a pre-listening activity in order to activate the correct schemata, what you could do is instead you choose a recording, any kind of good recording. Instead of playing the recording, you could ask your students, maybe in groups or in maybe as a pair work activity, to predict what the listening could be about. So you're not playing the recording, they just listen to the prompt. So you say that you're soon going to hear a conversation about two people talking about something, or you're going to hear a lecture about forest conservation. So they discuss what they think the recording could be about, and then you play it and they check whether their prediction was correct. And this is just an awareness, schemata awareness activity. The second one is my absolute favorite, which is dictogloss. For any kind of listening activity, this is my go-to task that I do with my students because it is versatile. You can do a dictogloss to practice listening and speaking. You could do a dictogloss to practice listening and writing if you want to. And the other thing that really a lot of teachers find very useful is because dictogloss needs very little preparation on your part. So all you need is to have a good listening, a good recording, or maybe a transcript that you can read off from. But if you're reading from a text, please remember, don't slow down because that will be counterproductive. So you read it at the pace you would normally read. And what your students will have to do is, for a gist listening dictogloss, they can work in groups or just as a pair. They don't have to take down notes. They listen to what you're saying or they listen to the recording, and they have to give in 2 or 3 sentences a summary of what they've heard. I'm going to come back to dictogloss when I do the next subskill, which is listening for specific detail. So hang on to that. The third activity, which is very useful, is if you can get a good transcript of a particular listening task. And these days, it's so easy to get it off the internet. So what you do is take the transcript and blot out the parts that have signal words. So your students then listen to the recording, they have the transcript in front of them, and they have to do a gap fill. So this, especially for lower level learners, this is really useful to bring awareness to how important these connected speech, this kind of transition words are important in discourse. Right. So the next subskill, which is very, very common in any kind of listening comprehension exam, is where you listen for detail. So needless to say, this is where you're listening to specific kind of information. It could be numbers, it could be names of people, it could be emotion, it could be specific facts. And this is a lower level listening task. Now, what you need your brain to understand is that you're not going to fixate on every information that comes to you. You will have to learn how to ignore irrelevancies, irrelevant details, which at least sound that they're not relevant. Now, if you want to practice something like this with your students, especially with lower level learners, what you could do is maybe select a weather report, or if your students are really into sports, you could choose maybe the latest results of any kind of sport that they're into. So what you do is you play the recording. Students can work in pairs if they want to, or if they want to do it as an individual exercise, that's absolutely fine. They have to take down notes here. So they listen to the recording, the names of the places, the corresponding weather pattern, or that particular sport, the names of the players, if they're into cricket, for example, how much the scores that the runs that they've scored. So they make notes of that, and this could be a very useful exercise in order to practice listening for detail. And you could also do a dictogloss with them, but I do a little bit of a variation here for this kind of dictogloss. So dictogloss is a little different from dictation. In dictation, your students will have to take down notes word for word, verbatim. In the case of dictogloss, you have to give a reconstruction of the text. So they listen to you or the recording, they take down notes, and they have to reconstruct the text in their own words. And the reconstruction has to be as close to the original as possible. So if they want to do that, they'll have to take down specific detail as well. Now, I also do something called a reverse dictogloss, which is more student-led. So maybe you could give your students a choice of themes that they want to practice on. So you give them a little bit of freedom here, and they do some minimum research on these themes. So they go back as a homework activity, they do a little bit of research. And when they come back for the class, they have to do an oral presentation. Now, their partner, or if they're doing in a group, their partner or their peers will have to take down notes now, and their partners will have to reconstruct what they have presented on. Now, in order for their partners to do a proper reconstruction, the original has to be delivered properly, the pronunciation has to be good. So you're doing a lot of things here. You're practicing not just listening, you're practicing listening and writing, because they'll have to do a reconstruction, which has to be in the form of summary. They also have to do a presentation. So it's listening and speaking again. So I would, if you're already doing something like this in your class, that's brilliant. But if you haven't before, go ahead and try dictogloss. It's really a lot of fun. The last skill, which is very important at higher level listening comprehension exams, is inferencing. So what is inference? Inference as a skill is where you're listening between the lines. So you're looking for information that's not very obviously stated. So you're scratching the surface a little bit to understand in context. Now, how do you do that? So in order to answer any kind of inference questions, you are again activating schemata. You're bringing into focus your memories associated with a situation like this. You are associating your knowledge of the world. So think about this. If you see or if you hear about a context like where a daughter and a mother are talking, and the daughter's saying, "I'm stepping outside to get some fresh air," and the mother says, "It's quite hot outside, isn't it?" So the mother really doesn't say, "Don't go out," but she definitely doesn't want the daughter to go out because it's hot outside. So it's the kind of inference, a very basic kind of inference, but because you have already maybe experienced something like this in your daily life. So these kind of questions are very important at higher levels, say at IC2, IC3 and upwards. So you're using clues or clues in the language to understand the context. You're using your own background knowledge, memories, sometimes even linguistic memories. So how do you practice something like this? So this in fact, needs a little bit of learner training. So you could choose anything from YouTube, maybe a show or a movie that your students are quite fond of. So you choose that, but instead of watching the show, they only listen to it. So they listen to the dialogue and they try and infer what's going on, who's talking, what the relationship between the speakers are. And then you play it, and the second time around, they also watch it. And this time they can check if their prediction, if their inferences were correct or not. So that gives you a little bit of idea, in a nutshell, the kind of sub skills that come into play when you're doing any kind of listening task. Now, it's all good to know these things, but there's one more thing that your learners really, really need to have a good grasp of, and that is a very important skill, which is called note taking. It's a very important study strategy, in fact, but it doesn't come naturally to everyone. So we have to step in and we have to train our learners how to take correct notes, because this is a skill that they will absolutely need if they're doing any kind of listening. Now, we cannot underestimate the processes in a note-taking exercise. Because when you're taking notes, you're selecting information, you're discarding irrelevancies, you're discarding information that you don't need, you're checking for information, you're reviewing, and these are all essential 21st century skills. So this is why a lot of universities these days give additional guidance sessions or note-taking for newbies for in a refresher course. So why wait for students to get to university when you can train them now at this very moment? So when you train your students on how to take notes, the first thing that you need to remember is they need to know why they're listening to something in order to be able to take the right note. What I mean by this is, if you're going to say that this talk or this conversation, the conversation that you're going to hear about is going to be a lecture on the advantages and disadvantages of tourism, right? So your learners will immediately know that, okay, it's advantages and disadvantages. So I need to maybe use 2 columns. So you need to know why you're listening, so you know how to take notes. The second thing that you need to remember is you don't need to write things word for word as you hear it. Use your own phrases, use your own language. Abbreviations are very important, symbols. Use bullet points that would make your notes a lot easier to pull out from, information to pull out from. And you also need to pay careful attention to signal words. Now, there are 3 very commonly used kind of strategies in note-taking. So let's see what these are. The first is a mind map, right? The mind map is the simplest note-taking strategy that a lot of us use at times. So you start off with the central subject or the heading in the middle, and information and subsidiary information that radiate outwards from the central topic, from the main topic. So this is quite versatile. It's a visual map. It becomes easier for you to pull out information. So that's one, the simplest. The second one, which a lot of universities, for higher studies, a lot of universities really are really advocate, at least the one that I went to really wanted us to take notes in this using the Cornell method, where you divide your writing into 2 columns. The narrow column is called the Q column, and where you put in, say, the keywords, right? So the Q column will have basic terminologies and keywords. And the broader column is your note column, where you fill in information corresponding to those keywords. And you could also keep a summary right at the bottom if you want to, as a note or a reminder for yourself. Now, what the Cornell method does is it looks very neat. It's very useful if you want to pull out information quickly and you've got your notes in place. So that will really help you later. The third one is the charting method. So if you can see, it looks like a matrix. It looks like a spreadsheet. So you've got your specific words, your cues in each column. And then you use, as you listen to the recording, you fill in according to the particular cues, you fill in your information as you go along. This is also one of the strategies that students like to use when they don't want to write a lot. So these three, if you can practice with your students, if you can teach them how to take note in these forms, it will be a lot useful when they're doing something in a time-bound situation like an exam, in a listening task. Right. Now, what the kind of tools that you can use, even if you're doing, if you're teaching online, there are some really, really useful websites that you could use. We all know BBC, TED Talks, British Council, they've got tons and tons of very valuable listening recordings that you can pull out and practice with your students. I also like listenwise.com because they've got a lot of, based on a lot of themes, which are again, all vetted recordings. So you choose according to the theme, the kind of recording you want to play with your students. And they've got plenty of interactive quizzes, open-ended activities, listening and speaking activities that you can practice with your learners. The other one that I really like is breakingnewsenglish.com. So this, you have both listening as well as reading text here, but they're all current affairs, news in the form of, news articles. So your students or your learners, according to the level, can choose a particular news article, they listen to it, and they've got, again, lots of pre-listening as well as post-listening exercises, interactive quizzes, again, lots of true and false activities, inference questions. So I find this very, very useful if you really want to do something online with your students. Right. So we've come to the end of the listening segment, and we're going to go now straight on to the speaking tasks in ISE. As I've mentioned earlier, speaking is tested along with listening in ISE through tasks like the topic task, collaborative, as well as conversation tasks. Now, we're going to do each of this, and I'm going to take you through these tasks in the next couple of minutes. So what happens in the topic task? A candidate is supposed to, this is one task where the candidate gets a lot of control, has a fair degree of control, in fact, because you prepare the topic in advance of your exam. So the topic has to be a personalized topic. So this task is heavily personalized. And then the examiner and the candidate will co-construct a dialogue around the topic, right? Now, I'm going to come to this in a bit, but I wanted you to have a look at this slide as well. Now, as you can see, this is language for IC1. So similarly, there, you have language and grammar requirements for all the levels at IC2, IC Foundation. You have to understand that Trinity's GESE and IC are English language exams. So it's not just about communication, it's also where these exams will require your students to demonstrate language and grammar items through these tasks. So you have about, say, 10 or 11 language functions in each level. It's not something that's very difficult, but they have to be evidenced through these tasks. So when I talk about a topic task, you have to understand that this is not a memory test, right? So you're not going to learn something by heart because you can prepare ahead of the exam. It is co-constructed, it is spontaneous, it's unscripted. So the examiner will look at your topic, the topic that you've prepared, the discussion points that you have, and ask you questions. So you have to respond to that. The examiner will ask you follow-up questions, but at no point is it going to be a one-way dialogue. It's not going to be a one-way conversation, a monologue. You have to get the examiner involved in the topic that you are going to talk about. So ideally, you have to choose a topic that is personalized because it is your topic task. The whole reason why Trinity wants you to go to prepare something personalized is because it gives you a chance to talk about yourself. So it's all about you here. You are at the center of the exam. The second thing is, like I've mentioned, you have to be able to demonstrate the language and grammar items of the level that you are at. So I see foundation has some grammar items. I see one has certain language functions. And through the topic task as well as conversation, you have to be able to bring in these language functions. You also will need to mention 3 or 4. So for every topic, at every level, you have discussion points. You come prepared with a discussion point, and the examiner will ask you questions, and you'll have to respond using long turns. So I'm going to talk about long turn in a bit. And you also have to ask the examiner at least one question. So it's a genuine communication. In any kind of genuine, authentic communication, it's never one-sided, right? So even here, you have to be able to not just talk or respond to examiner questions, you'll also have to ask the examiner 1 or 2 questions. Now, when we talk about long turn, let's think of this in any kind of conversation. When people talk, they take turns. This is an exception because I'm doing a webinar and I'm the one who's talking. But if I were to meet you face to face, I would maybe ask you questions and you would ask me questions. So this is where one speaker may need to give a little more information about a topic or maybe clarify a few doubts that the other person has. So this person speaks for a longer period of time. Now, at ISE, especially at Foundation and 1, you speak with long turn. At higher levels, you speak for a longer turn, which is a sustained turn. So it can go on for maybe, say, 4 or 5 or 6 sentences on something that the examiner asks. So this is an example of a sample mind map. This is what the examiner will be, this is what the candidate has to submit to the examiner. So I've just taken a random topic here because we're all teachers here. So I've just selected my favorite teacher, right? And these are your discussion points. So at ISE Foundation and 1, you need 4 such discussion points. But I have chosen 5 purposely because there is one point that is not a good point. And I would love for you to be able to tell me which one it is, but let me first tell you what an ideal discussion point should be. An ideal discussion point should be one that gives you a chance to talk in long turns, which will be ideally open-ended, right? A good discussion point will also be a point which will let you use the language of your level, right? So based on that, can you guess which discussion point is not a good point here? Can you write on the chat box? So there are 5 discussion points, and there's one which will not allow you to talk in a long turn. A long turn is where you talk at length about something. Please take a guess. All right. Okay, so that's right, Sharon, thank you so much. His or her name. This is not a good enough point because no matter how hard you try, it's not going to allow you to talk with a long turn. On the other hand, all other points will, you can at least talk for, say, even for a couple of minutes if you want. Now, let me take one point as an example. Suppose I say, why I prefer attending his classes to going for music lessons. So the examiner is going to ask me, why do you prefer attending his classes to going for music lessons? Then I can say, my favorite teacher is Mr. Dale Edwards, for example, right? I really like his classes, or I prefer attending his classes to any other lessons because his classes are always so interesting, or he's one of the kindest teachers I've ever come across. So I am speaking in long term, and I'm also using the language of the level. So what did I say? I have used I like or dislike, I really like, or I love attending his classes, or I prefer attending his classes because of these reasons. So this is an example of a good discussion point because it automatically gives you a chance to talk at length, gives you a chance to use long terms, will also give you a chance to use the language of your level. So the examiner is going to ask randomly any point, any discussion point, will choose one, and you have to talk about it. The examiner is going to ask you follow-up questions. Then you answer with a long term, you answer using the language of that level. And this goes on for about 4 minutes. This is similar to the topic stage in GESE exams, which some of you are familiar with. Right. Now, what kind of activities can you do if you're practicing a topic task with your students? Now, because it is so heavily personalized, there are a lot of activities that you can use which will lend itself to good communication, effective communication. So you could do maybe role playing, you could do reporting exercises, you could do storytelling. You could even get your students to talk about their personal lives, what they like, what they don't like, the kind of music they like to listen to, the kind of books or popular culture that they're fond of. So you are using these as warm-up activities before you move on to a proper topic task. Something that I do before I even get my students to think about the topics is what we call a 5-point star activity. What I do is maybe I show them this star which has 5 points or 5 edges, and these 5 points talk about 5 things that are important to me, right? Now, my students, my learners will have to look at this list and have to ask me questions, will have to ask me open-ended questions so that I get a chance to use the language of that level. At no point are they going to ask me questions like who, why. It has to be a complete whole question. So maybe they could ask me, maybe the first question could be, who is Rochelle? Why is, maybe if I say that Rochelle is my best friend, they can ask me a follow-up question. Why is Rochelle your best friend? Or they could ask me questions like, why do you prefer traveling to learning new languages? Or do you prefer traveling to learning new languages? And give me a chance to use the language of the level. So something like this will be a good warm-up. And then what they can do is they can work in pairs and do their own star activity. And they tell each other, their partners, about their stars, or the partners ask them about questions related to their stars. And once this is through, in the next class, you can do brainstorming about their own topic, because in their own topic, they again have to use a mind map, keep a personalized topic, and think about discussion points. So I think this is a good precursor to a mind map. Coming to the next task in ISE, which is a really, really popular task from ISE 2 upwards. You don't have it in ISE Foundation and 1. It's called collaborative task, which is similar to the interactive task in GESE. So if you're familiar with the interactive task, you would know that the examiner reads out a prompt. So you get about 4 minutes to co-construct a dialogue with the examiner about that prompt, but you have to be the one to take more initiative, more control of the conversation, and it's not the other way around. So the examiner is going to give you bare minimum information, and you have to be able to understand, you'll have to be able to ask more questions and bring the conversation to a logical conclusion. Now, what kind of prompts could you get? You could get a dilemma prompt, you could get a problem prompt or a dilemma prompt, you could get a discussion prompt, an opinion prompt. So I'm going to give you an example of what a collaborative prompt is actually. So the examiner could give you something like this. So here you can see it because we are doing a webinar, but imagine that the examiner is reading something like this. So my local college has a great range of courses, and I'd really like to study something, but I'm not sure which course to take. And they stop there. So it's your job to ask more questions, to find out more about the problem, and then give some kind of suggestion or advice depending on the prompt. Now, you have to understand that the examiner comes with a backstory for every prompt. What is a backstory? An imagined story, right? Your job is to extract that backstory from the examiner. So the more questions you ask, the better it is for you. But if you give a solution to the problem right at the start, the conversation is going to come to a close. So you don't want to do that at the first or the first half. You do it, maybe keep it, if it's a 4-minute task, maybe you start giving advice or suggestion from 3 minutes onwards. Yeah, so this needs a little bit of training, but a lot of students, in fact, young students, have a lot of fun with this particular task because they are so full of questions and they want to know more about the prompts, and they really enjoy this task. Now, if you're preparing your learners, of course, these are tips to understand the prompt better. You're not going to only fixate on some parts of the prompt. You're going to look at the whole picture. So if we take an example like this, it can be divided into 3 chunks, into 3 parts. My local college has a great range of courses. I really like to study something, and I'm not sure which course to take. So these are the 3 parts, and not just my local college has a range of courses and you start asking questions. So if you understand these 3 parts of the question, you could then focus your questions on these parts. So is it a reputed college? Or why do you want to study now? What are the courses that this particular college offers, and why do you find them interesting? So you are directing questions on specific parts of this one prompt. And then towards the end, what have you studied in the past? What have you studied in the past? Tell me about your reasons to study now. And then once you've got enough information from the examiner, you can give your advice or your suggestion. So remember, this is for 4 minutes, and 4 minutes is actually quite a long time. So you have to time it in such a way that you withhold this whole urge to ask questions, withhold the urge to give suggestions right at the start. Some of the things that you should keep in mind when you're doing a collaborative task is you're not the one who's only going to talk. Please remember to also include the examiner in the conversation, right? It's true that you have to take more responsibility, but the examiner also has to be included in this dialogue. So this is something that's very important, because a lot of times when you're tend to get carried away and you talk more, but you have to remember that there's another person in the conversation as well. So you divide it into chunks, you ask for more information, you do a little bit of probing, and it's important to ask in complete sentences and not say, why did this happen? So that, if you don't mind me asking, could you please share with me why this is so? So you're taking a little bit of time and you're fleshing out questions that also will help you, because if it is a 4-minute task, you know that the moment you ask short questions, it's going to come to an end very quickly, and you don't want that. And yes, the last point is very important. You don't want to give advice or jump into any kind of conclusion straight off. And the other thing that you also need to remember is you shouldn't be assuming anything about the examiner. Let the examiner share with you enough information, and then you go on to give some kind of suggestion. There are a lot of classroom ideas that you can do, especially if you're practicing collaborative tasks. What I like to do with my students is I like them to think about backstories. So we're reversing roles here. So if you're the examiner for this particular prompt, what kind of backstory could you have? And the other person, whoever they're working with, if it's their partner, will have to ask questions in order to get that backstory. You would also want to focus on activities that lead to question asking and question answering, and you could get your students to work in 2 or 3 in groups of 2 or 3, and you do a simulation exercise, the kind that would actually happen in a collaborative task. So we've come to almost the end of this section. there's one more task that we have in the ISE speaking section, which is called the conversation task. Every level in ISE will have prescribed subject areas, just like Jessie. So you've got about 5 or 6 subject areas in foundation, in 1 or 2 or 3. The ones that you see on the screen right now are travel, money, food. These are specified subject areas at ISE 1. So the examiner is going to randomly choose one subject area. You don't have a choice here. And he or she will ask you questions about this subject area. Again, it's not something that you memorize. It's co-constructed. It's very spontaneous. The examiner will not use any script to ask you questions. So they're going to ask you very simple questions about, say, travel or money. Why do you like traveling, or do you like to travel, or how important is it to save money, right? Etc. etc. What is your favorite food? Tell me a little more about it. So they give you enough chance to talk about these subject areas. They'll ask follow-up questions. So this goes on for about 2 minutes. But you have to answer with a long turn, and you have to use the language of your level. So that's the catch. So both at your topic stage as well as the conversation stage, you have to use the language of that level. I also wanted to end this segment by sharing with you a few links to the Trinity website. So it's got plenty and more of activities that you could use to practice listening and speaking with your students. In addition to this, Dale and I are going to share with you a few activities, maybe in another day or two, like we did with the reading and writing activities. And then you can use that in your classroom to practice listening and speaking. So that brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you so much. If you've got any questions, please ask me. Now is the time.
Thank you, Soma. Hopefully, teachers, if there are any questions, you can put it on the chat box.
That's right.
Or in the Q&A section. No?
That's okay. You can always write to me
Soma,
later.
it looks like we have no questions.
We have no questions. That's okay. If you have anything that you want to ask me later, you've got my email ID. Dale is going to share it again. So maybe you could ask questions later, and that's absolutely fine. Renu, are you there?
Thank you very much, Soma. Thanks for
Not at all. It's my pleasure.
This
Thanks a lot.
Of webinars, these 2 webinars, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you again and welcoming you again for another round of webinars, hopefully soon.
Thank you so much.
I know my connection's not.
Yes. So how can we Chandra Siri, right? How can we minimize the effect of effective filter? Yes. So through these, if you could do any of these activities that I have shared with you, this will definitely help in reducing the stress that comes in as a result of the whole experience of going through something that you maybe unknown content, right? So if you can do these activities, I'm pretty sure, if you give them the tools, it would be useful for your students to follow the processes in listening. Renu, I think we lost you.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry, my connection's really bad.
That's right.
Okay, so I was just saying thanks, Soma. I think you had a question there, but thank you again for joining us. And teachers, if there's nothing else, we can end the webinar. And if there's anything else, you can always reach out to Soma through me or through her email address.
Absolutely. Please do that. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.